So it really happened. Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 felony counts in the state of New York. And there has been a lot of reaction to that news, including and especially outrage and accusations from Republicans. But if I had to pick one response that is worth paying particularly close attention to, it would be this comment from the country's highest-ranking Republican.
I do believe the Supreme Court should step in. Obviously, this is totally unprecedented. People have to believe that justice is fair, that there's equal justice under law. They don't see that right now. And I think that the justices on the court, I know many of them personally, I think they're deeply concerned about that as we are. So I think they'll set this straight, but it's going to take a while.
Okay, set aside for a moment that very questionable bit about Speaker Johnson claiming to have a personal relationship with, presumably, the conservatives on the high court. The Speaker of the House is saying that the Supreme Court should step in and overturn Donald Trump's conviction. Can they do that? Can the Supreme Court upend justice here? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about what comes next for the convicted former president. First, there's the sentencing. Trump is scheduled to be sentenced on July 11th. He faces up to 4 years in prison, though the judge could also let him off with probation, which some experts say is typical for this kind of crime. Now, ahead of that hearing, Trump will sit for an interview with a probation officer who will put together what is called a pre-sentence report to get a sense of Trump's character and his behavior. That officer will then make a recommendation as to how heavy or how light Trump's sentence should be. On one hand, Trump has never been convicted of a crime before now, which should weigh in favor of a lighter sentence. On the other, Trump has shown precisely zero remorse for the crimes he has just been convicted of. He has attacked the judicial process throughout his entire trial, and he has repeatedly violated the gag order that prohibits him from talking outside of court about the parties involved in this case. That gag order is still very much in effect, and this morning, Trump likely violated it again when he talked about star witness Michael Cohen without exactly mentioning his name.
By the way, this was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But, you know, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that.
So all of that mishegas might suggest a stricter sentence. Once Trump is sentenced in mid-July, he can then officially appeal his conviction. Right after sentencing, Trump will have 30 days to file a notice of appeal, basically indicating to the court that he intends to keep fighting his conviction. Then, depending on his sentence, Trump will have anywhere between 4 to 6 months to actually appeal. All of this could potentially stretch past the election and toward the end of this year, possibly as late as December. And then the prosecution will get time, usually several months, to file its response to Trump's appeal. Once that happens, the case is then in the hands of the New York Appellate Division's First Department, which is composed of 21 justices. Despite a picture that went viral today showing 5 of the justices, who are all black women, and suggesting that Donald Trump's fate would be in their hands, there is no reason to believe that specifically these 5 justices would be the ones chosen to hear an appeal. Or, by the way, that there would be anything wrong with it if they are chosen. Again, the case isn't likely to reach that court until sometime next year, and it could take that court until early 2026 to make its decision. So what about Speaker Mike Johnson's fever dream of the Supreme Court stepping in? Well, let's say the appellate court decides to uphold Trump's conviction. If Trump loses that first appeal, he can then appeal again to New York's highest court. Now, in any other state, that would be the state Supreme Court. But New York is weird. You probably already knew that. So here we call our highest court the New York Court of Appeals, which isn't confusing at all. But if Trump takes his case all the way to New York State's highest court and he loses, he's got one last Hail Mary. Can you guess what it is? It's the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is not obligated to hear any appeals from a state court. But given the way this particular Supreme Court has treated this particular defendant, you probably can't rule it out. So in other words, there is a chance that sometime in the not too distant future, Donald Trump could have his 34 felony convictions thrown out by a rogue conservative Supreme Court. In the meantime, Donald Trump, felon and frontrunner, has to continue to work his way through the appeals process, just like any other defendant. And while that happens, Trump is taking his fight to the court of public opinion, where he is intent on trying to undermine the integrity of the American judicial system. Joining me now are Anna Bauer, legal fellow and courts correspondent for Lawfare, and Duncan Levin, a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York. Thank you for joining me. I see you guys both have notes. That's good, because I have a lot of questions. First, Duncan, just weigh in, if you will, on the prospects of an appeal here. Trump is clearly going to do
an
it.
appeal is 100% likely.
Yeah.
To get to the United States Supreme Court, really all you need is 5 friends on the United States Supreme Court and a pathway to get there,
right.
And then you have grounds for reversal. The first stop is the New York State appellate courts, and I think you're likely to see a number of arguments that really go nowhere. Mr. Trump's going to throw his lawyers under the bus for not objecting.
Really? I can't imagine.
Like he's done for every other lawyer, not objecting enough during Stormy Daniels' testimony and letting all those salacious details come in. Although, of course, that's the reason the prosecutors brought out that testimony in the first place, to show the power of Stormy Daniels' testimony and the story that was going to come out right on the heels of that Access Hollywood tape.
Right.
He's going to argue that he couldn't get a fair jury pool in New York because he's so notorious here, although that's largely true of anywhere he gets a trial. He's going to argue that there's a novel application of this statute that's never been used before, although just because it's novel doesn't mean they can't do it.
Can we pause on that? Because there's a lot. I have asked other lawyers whether they think this is novel, and I get different responses. Ankush Kardori, writing in Politico today, says if Trump has a good path to an appeal, it's based on this idea that state law is effectively mixing with federal law in this case. Can you first break that down, and then can you weigh in on your thoughts?
I don't think that's going to actually be the most effective pathway into federal court for him, and that's because if you take a step back and look what this case is, it is that Mr. Trump caused the falsification of business records with the intent to conceal a conspiracy to promote his election by unlawful means.
Right.
It doesn't say that the unlawful means can't be a violation of federal law. There's nothing saying that it needs to be state law. So
there were 3 options that I think the judge outlined. One was tax laws, one was falsification of other business records, and the other one was a federal campaign finance law, right?
Well, so
did I pass my exam?
You did very well. And I have to say that I think that is exactly where this appeal is going to lie to get him into federal court. There is this concept of a writ of habeas corpus. And when this is all going to start in the state appellate courts. And for that reason, I don't think we're going to see the end to this in the state courts before the election. But he's going to try to get into federal court on this writ of habeas corpus that his federal constitutional rights were violated. And I think there's no New York State law that says that there has to be unanimity on the means by which he unlawfully promoted his election.
Right.
But there is some federal law out there that says that where the facts are so complicated or the facts are so different, there has to be a unanimity direction given to the jury. And that if there isn't, that it could theoretically violate a defendant's Sixth Amendment rights under the United States Constitution to a fair trial. I'm not saying that is a meritorious appeal, but that is going to be his pathway into the federal courts, that there's federal law on this, talking about the Sixth Amendment right in the United States Constitution as opposed to a violation of his New York State constitutional rights. And once he gets into federal court, he's going to be rocketing up to his 5 friends on the Supreme Court. And I think that's, once he gets his foot in the door there, that's what his plan was going to be.
So what's the scuttlebutt on the appeals court, the second highest? I mean, there are 21 justices. I know it's hard to generalize given the number of justices there, but do you think that they would be inclined to hear this, to give Trump the benefit of the doubt?
Well, this is going to the appellate court, the intermediate appellate court, as a matter of right. He's a right to appeal there. Whether the Court of Appeals, which, as you say, is the highest one. I know it's all upside down.
The second highest court, the first division, whatever.
The appellate division is the middle one. That is, it's definitely going there. Whether it goes to the Court of Appeals is something that's discretionary. It probably will, given the weight of the case. But there's really nothing under state law that he has a leg to stand on. And so to the extent that he has any real shot at getting this overturned, it's going to be in the federal courts. And even that, look, it's a long shot to get anything overturned. If your name is Donald Trump, maybe you have a better chance in the federal courts, because this is a case of that is in a category all to its own.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just looking at the Supreme Court that was not even supposed to take up the immunity case and is now seriously deliberating over it. Could it remand it back to district court? I mean, what's your expectation about the Supreme Court getting involved in this, Anna?
I mean, look, I as you said, Alex, it's going to be a while, I think, if they do get involved. I think that it will have to go through up to the New York Court of Appeals. But I do think that it seems like Donald Trump, as you said, you've got to have 5 friends on the Supreme Court. Seems like Donald Trump does have 5 friends on the Supreme Court. But I also think it really just depends on the issues. If there are any of these issues that are attractive to the Supreme Court, it may very well be the preemption argument that we just discussed. Although I do think it's a really heavy lift, and it would kind of upend a lot of the established
precedent.
It could be,
but that sounds like it's tailor-made for Sam.
Exactly.
Well, this is one of those moments where you wish you had a Supreme Court that wasn't enmeshed in all these controversies, where you would believe that if they took a case, it would be on the merits of it and not because they're fully radicalized in any way. That
waving insurrectionist flags in front of their beach houses.
That they're actually looking at the law in a fair way. So if he can get into federal court, all bets are off. This case is unlike any other, and Mr. Trump has a rocket up to them. And
when you say a rocket, just to be clear, can he circumvent the appellate division in New York, or does he has to go through this many month long procedure before he can do an end run? Is that right?
The law is pretty clear that this is going to go through the New York State appellate process before, and needs to be completely exhausted before the federal courts can step in on this writ of habeas corpus. That's really his only way in.
So we could be looking at 2025, 2026. Who knows who's president? Who knows if there's jail time or probation, and maybe the Supreme Court getting involved.
We could be sitting here years from now talking about this. So.
What could go wrong?
Right.
What could go wrong? All right. Well, Terra Incognito, Anna Bauer, Duncan Levin, it's great to see you guys. Thank you so much for helping me through all of this, helping all of us.